Chapter 1. I am not Adam Lanza's psychiatrist. Author's disclaimer. The information presented in this chapter was gathered from public information published about the event, the troubled young man who has been referred to as the shooter, and his mother, a lovely woman and caring mother who needed help for herself and her son. It presents a poignant example of a possibly unrecognized and untreated individual with neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Although provocative and perhaps offensive to some, my inclusion of this as a first chapter provides a call to action for understanding and treatment of this preventable condition. The chapter title is a spin-off of a blog, I Am Adam Lanza's Mother, written by Liza Long in the Blue Review. The morning of December 14th, 2012, I walked my 6-year-old kindergartner and 9-year-old third grader into their Spanish enrichment classes in our quiet community in suburban Maryland. As that unremarkable workday began, I didn't question whether I would see my children after school. Amidst a morning of report writing and seeing patients, the unprovoked slaughter of so many innocent children and adults at Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut silently unfolded. Patients shared descriptions of the unthinkable tragedy they had heard on the news. Shaken and dismayed by the accounts, my heart ached for the parents of those young children and the school staff. For a parent, possibly the worst nightmare is losing a child to such a cruel and insensitive act of violence. Throughout the day, I said a selfish prayer. Dear God, please be with the families in Connecticut, and please be with my children. Helping others through stress, fear, and turmoil in their lives limits my coming unraveled at problems that do not directly affect me, my family, or my patients. With the holidays rapidly approaching, professional and personal obligations superseded my watching media coverage about the shootings. And because my own kids were similar in age to the innocent children in Connecticut, I did not allow myself to dwell on and become even more upset about the senseless act of violence. Being the daughter of a police officer who blossomed into a child psychiatrist, I had learned early in life to compartmentalize and diffuse rather than dramatize and exaggerate catastrophe. For several days after the deadly, heinous event, I avoided the radio, newspapers, internet, and news to maintain peace and balance in my own life. Nonetheless, over the intervening days, I began to hear snippets from patients, friends, and neighbors. One mother told me that the young man perpetrating the shooting seemed slightly autistic. A girlfriend said he had sensory issues that led to him wearing noise-reducing headphones during the incident. My sister-in-law mentioned she heard he had social and academic issues, leading him to leave college and return home to live with his mother. The occasional fleeting thought arose amid the media hype that he might have ND-PAE. During a brief exchange by phone with a mom in my practice, she remarked that he resembled her adoptive daughter from Russia. I replied that his profile was chillingly similar to individuals with ND-PAE I had interviewed on death row. Days later, while flipping the channel between wrapping gifts, I gasped. The vacant eyes and gaunt face of a young man who seemed to have fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS, stared back at me. The reporter identified him as Adam Lanza, the perpetrator of the mass murders at Sandy Hook Elementary. How is it that both I and my patient's mother recognized FAS in his face and history, yet hardly anyone else in the world seemed to notice? There were many red flags in his history to indicate he was affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. Media reports painted a picture of a boy who was socially awkward, introverted child who had developed into an antisocial, isolated, angry young man. Former classmates described him as bright but extremely shy and remote. The Huffington Post reported that when People approached him in the hallways. He would press himself against the wall or walk in a different direction, clutching tight to his black briefcase. He was often having crises that only his mother could diffuse. Some of his anxious episodes led him to run away to avoid being in class or doing schoolwork. His autistic-like behaviors, social communication, learning issues, dropping out of college, difficulty launching into an independent lifestyle, and rage issues were difficult even for his mother to control. Radio broadcasters noted that his mother was well known at a local bar and portrayed her as a big-time party girl, although also was somewhat reclusive even to members of her book club. Since ND-PAE can happen as early as the 3rd week after conception, many women expose their babies to the binge drinking before knowing they are pregnant. During the years around his birth in April 1992, women viewed use of alcohol during pregnancy very differently than when the warning label came out in 1981. Yet whether Nancy Lanza used alcohol during pregnancy likely went to her grave. In May of 1997, my aunt had clipped and sent me a newspaper article about the hallmark findings of increased drinking in pregnancy from 1991 to 95. Maternal alcohol use rose by 400% from 1991 to 95, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. With the article in hand, I left for an internship as a medical student with ABC's Good Morning America. After pitching the story idea to the medical producer of The Healthy Woman, together we produced a segment warning women to use contraception if using alcohol and having sex, and to plan their pregnancies very carefully to avoid unintentional prenatal alcohol exposure. Now, as I sat wrapping Christmas gifts 15 years later, I saw firsthand a likely byproduct of that epidemic. Overcoming dismay, shock, and revulsion for the massacre, I speculated about the hardwiring flaws causing his impaired mental state at the time of the senseless crime. Immediately scouring the internet for information about the case to see if anyone else suspected that he had ND-PAE, I realized I was not alone. Others had the same idea, reporting on their personal blogs that his facial features and low-set ears appeared as in those with FAS. Based on his behaviors, physical features, self-regulation, and learning and social challenges, he was a young man who suffered from ND-PAE. A variety of television reports mentioned that investigators conducted genetic tests to look for hereditary problems, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome mutations, and other genetic disorders linked to the young man's mental state. Doctors such as me, working with children who have complex neurodevelopmental issues, often test for and explore possible genetic and prenatal exposures, such as alcohol. These organic issues can be linked to defective brain wiring associated with maladaptive, impulsive, and violent behaviors. Without a doubt, Lanza was a seriously ill young man with a chronic, undiagnosed neurodevelopmental condition. Over the years, however, doctors likely never asked his upper-class mother whether she drank when she was pregnant or prior to pregnancy recognition. My insight into the connection between prenatal alcohol exposure and juvenile violence is mirrored in The Fatal Link, the connection between school shooters and the brain damage from prenatal exposure to alcohol by Jody Allen Crow. Like me, Crow's perspective comes from his personal and professional experiences, having graduated from the high school where the first mass school shooting occurred in 1966 in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, to his work as an educator on Native American reservations. During the summer of 2015, Jody presented with me and 3 of my interns at the International Congress on the Law and Mental Health in Vienna, Austria. Sharing his insights about the Red Lake rampage that shook the nation, he was dismayed that media reports failed to acknowledge the possible effects of prenatal alcohol exposure on the shooter's mental status. Despite features of FAS in the shooter's face and recognition that his mother was a severe alcoholic. He also found evidence of unrecognized ND-PAE in cases of school shooters in Wisconsin and Minnesota all the way back to 40 years ago. The catastrophic case of Adam Lanza and other school tragedies outlined in Crow's book suggests to me the need for drastic paradigm shifts in our society's awareness about mental illness and ND-PAE, the leading cause of preventable brain damage affecting our children. Unfortunately, few mental health providers know much about ND-PAE and sometimes make matters worse by over-medication, inadequate inpatient and residential care, and improper parent guidance. While those children and adolescents who receive treatment for mental illnesses are no more likely to commit violent acts than the average adolescent, the costs of not identifying and treating ND-PAE and other neuropsychiatric disorders can be devastating for our communities, families, and children. Adam Lanza is like countless other complex patients with multiple disorders who have received less than optimal treatment and community support. According to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, around 20%, that is 7 to 12 million of American youth, are affected by mental illness, and only 20% ever receive treatment. As a whole, the field of child adolescent psychiatry and psychology is woefully understaffed and underfunded, with the field being in the category of physician manpower shortage area since the 1970s. Even if every child and teen who needs treatment were to seek services, providers and appropriate hospitals would only be available in certain locations in the country. In my own practice, one 12-year-old girl with intellectual disability associated with prenatal alcohol exposure waited in the emergency room for more than 10 days before being placed in a psychiatric ward not equipped to handle her neurodevelopmental issues and cognitive deficits. A 19-year-old patient with ND-PAE waited for 3 weeks in the emergency room before her parents decided to take her to a therapeutic foster home where she is currently receiving comprehensive services for reactive attachment disorder. In speaking with the medical director of the hospital, he said, "It is not uncommon to have a young person wait 6 months for a bed, stuck in purgatory of the emergency room without receiving meaningful treatment. Others languish in prisons and jail cells, waiting placement on voluntary commitments. Improving our society's commitment to child psychiatry would improve psychological and emotional development for the most vulnerable of our children." A recent comprehensive report on Adam Lanza highlighted a lack of response from the educational and healthcare systems, as well as untreated mental illness, as primary contributors to Adam Lanza's progressively worsening condition. Several recommendations mentioned in the report: universal mental health screening for children, birth through age 21, better training for educators, better support programs for families, better financial support for school-based therapy-related services, that is, occupational therapy and behaviorist services, additional support to provide in-school services for children with highly specialized needs. Had I been Adam Lanza's psychiatrist, I would have helped develop a well-rounded treatment plan, as the psychiatrist who evaluated him most likely attempted to do. The comprehensive services would have included socialization activities such as socially engineered play groups from an early age, Boy Scouts or similar hands-on recreational activity, and therapeutic social skills group training, farm animal or equine therapy, parent guidance and education, as well as involvement in healthier outlets, for example, team or individual sports and or recreational activities, to replace his obsession with video games. I would have recommended that his mother and father take him for walks and hikes in nature while camping in mature hardwood forests, exploring caverns, and spending time on farms caring for docile, domesticated animals. There are often years of psychosocial interventions necessary to prevent catastrophes such as Sandy Hook. Despite earlier missed opportunities for healing, Adam Lanza likely needed hospitalization, followed closely by residential treatment during the weeks leading up to the massacre. So often, even in residential treatment centers, children and adolescents with ND-PAE go unnoticed by staff and misdiagnosed as oppositional, defiant, garden variety ADHD, bipolar, anxious, or depressed by psychiatrist, and over-medicated on a number of highly potent antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. The goal becomes chemical restraint rather than understanding the adolescent's brain wiring issues. Often, professionals fear that a diagnosis of ND-PAE is a death sentence, stigmatizing the individual to a life in the underclass. More training is needed for medical professionals and mental health providers to understand that. The proper diagnosis allows a right to life of purpose, dignity, and strength through understanding, treatment, and commitment on the part of the community. Educating primary care physicians about ND-PAE, who may see these children in their practices but may not understand the impact of a mother's drinking behaviors prior to pregnancy recognition, would help identify more of these children early enough to benefit from a coordinated systems of care approach. These policies for identification of children must be incorporated into better access to outpatient mental health and substance abuse services for affected individuals. In my view, even if we identified every single one of the 1 in 20 children with ND-PAE in our country, there would not be enough programs and services to meet their complex needs. Specialized school programs for children with ND-PAE are needed in this country to help teach them based on their learning styles, to support their challenges and nurture their strengths, to teach emotional regulation and instill a moral compass through character development, and to provide an avenue for their success and productivity. That is, apprenticeship programs, vocational studies, recreation and hobbies, life skills training, social skills classes, speech and language programs. We must embrace families with children affected by our most favored beverage, helping them raise their children with the proper supports, education, vocational assistance, housing, and healthcare benefits. Identifying, treating, and preventing this condition will help move our society into a new age of reduced juvenile delinquency, violence, and other secondary outcomes of undiagnosed ND-PAE. Over 22 years ago, I entered the field of public health with an understanding of the long-term consequences of undiagnosed and untreated prenatal alcohol exposure. At that time, the research community had joined with parent advocacy organizations to promote awareness and develop resources for affected families. Researchers and caregivers described a range of physical, developmental, emotional, and behavioral effects associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Dr. Ann Strythguth, a pioneer in diagnosis and treatment of affected individuals at the University of Washington at Seattle, described the continuum of effects as an iceberg phenomenon. The tip above the waterline is made up of children with dysmorphic features evident to the naked eye. The majority of affected individuals have neurodevelopmental deficits less visible to the naked eye and less pronounced physical features. A concise explanation of this phenomenon comes from founder of the FAS Family Resource Institute, Josie DeVries, and founding editor of Iceberg in Washington State, Dale Luthold, whose pioneering advocacy have provided important resources for families across the country. Figure 1, the iceberg phenomenon. Most cases are hidden below water level among the socially disenfranchised, vulnerable, complex, and misunderstood clients frequenting homeless shelters, psychiatric, and criminal justice systems. ARBD, which is alcohol-related birth defects, represents the fewest cases, early binge exposures leading to physical birth defects. And then FAS represents 10 to 15% of the cases, early binge exposures leading to dysmorphic, small size, and neurodevelopmental disorders. Only about 10 to 15% are cases that are usually recognized in early childhood, and that would be FAS. But ARND, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, represents 85 to 90% of the cases, which are non-dysmorphic. And that means they don't have the physical facial features. They don't have the growth retardation. Those are ones with functional birth defects. This was terminology before the new DSM-5 criteria, which now has replaced those categories with neurodevelopmental disorder associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. Because all of the children, no matter if they have birth defects, facial features, growth retardation or not, they all have neurodevelopmental disorders. Anne Strythguth, PhD, and her colleagues had been studying the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure since 1973 and were well aware of what was lurking below the waterline. Dr. Strythguth became famous in the research world for her statement that FAS was only the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg symbolizes a concept that applies both to fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol effect, and to the powerful social, political, and personal ramifications that are associated with this disease. A small part of the problem is visible, but the bulk of the problem is obscured and hidden. The problem is enormous and complex, like an iceberg. The visible portion of the problem gives us warning of hidden danger. We're not sure of the extent of that danger. We don't know how big it is. We are sure the danger is real, but we are in the process of learning how to best use our resources and energies to fight it. As a child psychiatrist, I believe Adam Lanza's pattern of physical, neurodevelopmental, and emotional characteristics were hauntingly similar to individuals with features below the waterline of the iceberg, having parents who were ill-equipped and distraught about how to help him. Their reluctance to insist that he receive treatment caused him to suffer in silence behind closed doors at home rather than face the social repercussions of psychiatric care. What responsibility do parents have to protect others when a psychiatrist or other mental health professional deems them in need of services but the parents fail to follow through? Would his parents have let him go without treatment if he had juvenile diabetes or high blood pressure? What about a broken bone or concussion? Our society must shed the veil of stigma associated with brain-based neurodevelopmental conditions, much like we have promoted policies for inclusion of individuals with physical limitations, such as blindness, paraplegia, loss of limbs, etc. We must ensure funding for improved mental health programming for children and adolescents, including intervening if necessary, even when parents are reluctant. In the absence of early, accurate diagnosis, a majority of unfortunate individuals with ND-PAE end up in catastrophic circumstances similar to Adam Lanza. Proper diagnosis, treatment, and support can improve their prognosis by giving them the services necessary to live relatively productive lives. Without diagnosis and treatment, it is the march of the penguins off the iceberg to death row for far too many individuals. No matter the precipitants, the act of merciless violence in Newton, Connecticut set fire to my passion to inform the public of the need to prevent ND-PAE. Just as I felt compelled to take on this cause in 1993, a renewed call to action 20 years later came in the form of the unspeakable tragedy at Sandy Hook. It has been my opinion for more than 2 decades that such senseless act of rage and disinhibited violence are worthy of our society acknowledging root causes of violent and destructive acts to better protect our children and communities. This work has taken me to maximum security prisons in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Tennessee. Like other esteemed forensic colleagues, I have examined and provided expert testimony to help judges, prosecutors, and public defenders understand the brain damage associated with prenatal alcohol exposure, particularly as a mitigating factor in capital murder cases. Fortunately, my journey did not begin or end on death row. I have had the privilege to venture there temporarily as a witness to humanity's failure to solve its social disparities in an ethically responsible way. Hopefully, insights into lives of individuals with this disorder, now behind bars, will create lasting societal change to protect all our children, even the unborn yet to be.